It is my great pleasure to give real life stories for our second panel and about some of the ways, both the experiences that our panelists have experienced, as well as the support they've provided for entrepreneurs. And so we have some perspectives from ecosystem builders, and our panel will be moderated by Tori Gonzalez. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for this opportunity. This has been an amazing couple of hours. It's flown by. We are going to talk about perspectives from ecosystem builders. And we heard some great information from founders, and I'm going to incorporate some of what I heard into some of the questions that I'll have for our panelists. I think that we are still missing one of our panelists, Stephanie Dorsey. So be on the lookout, please, for getting Stephanie in. But I'll go ahead and get started. First of all, I'd like to just introduce myself. I'm Tori Gonzalez. I'm based in St. Louis. I am an engineer by training with an MBA, 15 years in corporate, 20 years as a tech founder, tech startup or entrepreneur. I went through the NSF SBIR process twice and was a grantee for 2 different companies. I have served as a panel reviewer, and I serve on an NSF subcommittee that looks specifically at how do we make SBIR more inclusive, specific to the NSF. So this is a topic very near and dear to my heart. We have an extraordinary panel today. So our panel is focused on practical ideas to help ecosystem builders address the barriers and challenges that Black and Brown founders face in trying to access SBIR. The way that I'm going to set this up, I'm going to actually talk a little bit about each of the panelists, and then I'm going to kick it off with a couple of specific questions. So first, Dr. Damon Tull is the Director for Industry Alliance at UC Davis Graduate School of Management and the Mike and Renee Child Institute for Innovation and Entrepreneurship. So his research interests include kind of the financial and human capital flow of our national innovation ecosystem. So in other words, his research is focused on everything that we've been talking about today. Dr. Tull works with companies and charitable organizations, national education stakeholders, and federal government and sponsors. There's Stephanie, great, for strategic partnerships, and is always striving to make it more inclusive. We have Ms. Kim Mozingo, Director of Federal Programs for TEDCO. TEDCO was founded 23 years ago to foster technology transfer and commercialization from the Maryland universities and federal labs. And it's the state's leading source of funding for early stage technology-based businesses. In her role, Ms. Mozingo is responsible for engaging with the federal government to convert research to new jobs. And she runs an intensive 5-month SBIR STTR proposal writing workshops. It's a writing workshop to teach business owners a skill that's going to benefit them. So the graduates from her lab are awarded Phase 1 awards at more than double the national average, which the national average is 15% awardees. So we'll talk to her about that. The third panelist, Ms. Stephanie Dorsey, is the founding partner of E²JDJ VC. This is a venture capital fund investing in innovative food companies disrupting the way we eat. Ms. Dorsey is a lawyer by training from Harvard Law School and works as an advisor and mentor for multiple initiatives and nonprofits working to celebrate diversity and support social innovation. So this particular role requires Ms. Dorsey to understand the risk of early stage companies, what it takes to move them down the commercialization path. And she is a reviewer for SBIR grants. And so she is going to be able to provide us with some keen insights in what founders should be doing to move their technologies towards commercialization. And hopefully we'll have some discussion as well based on the previous panel about kind of what happens in the room when you're reviewing these SBIR grants. And our fourth panelist is Mr. Kerry Bowie, principal at MSADA Partners and founder and president and executive director of Majira project. So the mission of Majira is community development through entrepreneurship with a focus on supporting startups and small businesses led by founders of color and or serving underserved communities. The Majira project matches post-accelerator companies serving underserved communities with pro bono consultants from the Boston Consulting Group. And then Mr. Bowie also is an instructor for I-Corps, which we heard a lot about in the last panel. And we'll share why this program is an important component for SBIR. So our four panelists, thank you all for being here. And I am going to start with Dr. Tull. So Dr. Tull, you conducted an informal study that found 85% of SBIR awardees had PhDs. And we heard a bit about that from Dr. Grant's research. Yet in 2019, only 7.1% of all doctorates awarded to US citizens were African American. So this statistic means we're leaving a lot of people out of the process. So can you share some specific changes that you have thought about and or researched to make the SBIR program more accessible and especially to historically marginalized people?
Well, thank you, Tori, for that question. And it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you for that opportunity to respond to this. And yes, we did. I commissioned a study to understand the degree attainment of PIs in the SBIR program as part of my efforts to expand a national postdoctoral program across multiple agencies. And we learned that 85% of PIs in phase 2 of SBIR at the NSF in FY16, for example, held PhDs in their field. We also learned that 70% of the phase 2 awardees, the CEOs of those companies, 70% of them held PhDs. And this was regardless of whether they were SDBs, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, regardless of the type of organization. And this is a signal, in my opinion, to the ecosystem, because the NSF, SBIR, and SBIR in general, the FAQ is very clear. A PI is not required to have a PhD or any other degree. So I believe this is an opportunity for SBIR agencies to reflect on who are serving within the SBIR program. And we expect these numbers to vary a little bit across different agencies. We expect it to be a little bit lower in terms of percent PhDs in the DoD programs, comparable if not higher in the NIH programs, but depending on the mission. And in general, there are three, I have three recommendations, but there's some broad responses that come to mind from the various agencies. One of them is to diversify the review panel. In order to reach the different groups that we want to reach in SBIR, we must have a diversity amongst the review panel participants, and I believe in also to help with understanding what's happening at that level, that the demographic breakdown of reviewers should be reported back to the SBA and the OII in particular. And my suggestions are going to be structural because I see things at the system level and the structural level, and that's one of the areas I think is an opportunity. And also, I believe that MSI outreach has to be more holistic. I had the opportunity to run an NSF-funded meeting called the Strategic Innovations Investment Summit, where we brought together small and medium colleges from around the country to describe what are some of the challenges in performing research in science and engineering on a broader scale. And central to that issue was teaching load. The teaching burden in many of the historically teaching schools prevent innovation and research to happen more broadly. So I believe this is also an opportunity for SBIR and other federal agencies that want to engage in extramural activities and research to engage in more deeper collaboration. and to create ways to address some of the structural impediments to research and innovation at small and medium colleges. But I have three recommendations. And the first one, as I mentioned before, this 85% PhD represents a very tall R in this program. In the SBIR, we have to find ways to increase innovation, or the I in SBIR in general. And what I mean by this is that, innovation is far more accessible than entrepreneurship and research. I mean, anyone can discover and develop something new anywhere in the country. It can happen in a rural plant or a backyard in Missouri or at a laboratory at UC Davis, but it is the barrier of the entrepreneurship and the research challenge that is there. So based on this information that we're seeing is that there's an implied definition of innovation within the SBIR program. And I believe there's an opportunity for SBIR agencies to revisit their definition of innovation so that programs can be more inclusive and they don't miss the opportunity to discover someone with something new. And 5 years ago, I suggested, in addition to the SBIR, STTR program, an additional third leg, if you will, to the stool called the Small Business Social Innovation Research Program to fund social innovation nationally. I believe this would heighten the visibility of the SBIR program and support innovation, the idea of innovation anywhere, opportunity everywhere, and broaden participation in innovation beyond STEM. My second recommendation is also structural. There should be an executive office that reports to the head of Office of Investments in Innovation to examine SBIR program through a DEI lens, review policy, and ultimately implement cross-agency interventions to broaden participation. This office would assemble all the SBIR agency leads and any chief diversity officers within each agency to understand the ecosystem in depth. In my journey, I found it exceedingly difficult to implement effective programs across agencies because of silos. But this idea is to provide some overarching support for smaller agencies where they don't have the administrative resources to participate. And therefore, PI would participate in this cross-agency programs that would be developed as a centralized benefit of being an SBIR company or agency. And thirdly, and finally, my suggestion here is that SBIR agencies, unfortunately, are overly restricted in how they can use their administrative funds to address diversity, at least in the last previous authorization. And therefore, unfortunately, has led to programs that have limited impact and very, the drag is just difficult to manage. So I see two opportunities here. Option one is to allow the individual agencies to freely pilot more DEI related programs using administrative funds, especially when it comes to not just outreach, but also training in other areas. But also the second option is to allow the OII, in this case, to retain up to a portion of the administrative funds to implement system-wide engagement across the different agencies to help broaden participation of persons from underrepresented groups and MSIs.
Wow, thank you. Very thoughtful, and I think I will probably have some follow-up questions on some of those. But let me get some of the other panelists some questions. So, Ms. Mozingo, you run an intensive 5-month SBIR proposal writing workshop where your graduates win phase 1 awards more than double the national average. We talked about that. Are there 2 or 3 recommendations that you can share with those who live in states that maybe don't have programs like yours that might help them strengthen, ESOs strengthen their programs to help fellow people apply?
Sure. Thank you for that question. That's an important question. I think that it's important to understand that I do have FAST funding from the SBA, so federal and state technology entrepreneurship program, and that provides not quite half of the funding that we need to run the program. So the other half comes from my organization, the Maryland Technology Development Corporation, and so one of the first things I'll say is that there are 32 states, including Puerto Rico, that have FAST funded organizations. So there is most states have FAST funding. And these are agencies, these are organizations that there's one per state that has funding specifically to provide education on SBIR or support on SBIR and STTR. Our program seems to be a little bit more on steroids than a lot of other ones. A lot of them are very much kind of one-on-one counseling, and we do cohort of 25 companies through this 5-month program. So, you know, barring that, then, you know, I shared in the chat a couple of links to support resources that the SBA has on their website, sbir.gov. And that's important, you know, you start there. But, you know, I will say one of the things that I've heard a lot today is this need for education, this need for communication. So when I look at our program and I say, you know, why did we do so well? So our program targets women-owned businesses, rural businesses, most of Maryland, landmass wise is rural, and small disadvantaged businesses. Why are we able to recruit cohorts that are full of these types of companies that have been traditionally marginalized? And that's because we've spent a lot of time building relationships. So I'm a big proponent of strategic communication practices, and I think that we all should think about this. We need to be building trust and credibility with each other. So those of us that are in entrepreneurial support organizations need to be doing exactly what we're doing today. We're sharing information, building relationships with each other, helping to get the word out. Because we can't help people with SBIR applications or help them find the right agency if they don't know what SBIR is. They don't know that we exist to help them with that. So that's a challenge. Fortunately, we have programs where we're, you know, throughout the state, we have people positioned in rural communities and in urban communities so that they live where the companies are. They're a trusted resource. They get to know the businesses in the area, and they're building those relationships and doing so on a constant basis. So when I look at, you know, we had 70 applicants this time. We selected 26 to participate this year in the proposal lab. I shared this information with Dr. Warner, so I'm glad I had it available. When I looked at where those 70 companies found out about us, most of them found out about the proposal lab from our newsletter. So that as a communication tool, you know, if you build a communication tool that has a lot of credibility, you're providing very valuable information because you're listening to the people that are reading your newsletter and using that source of information, and you're responding to their needs in that piece of communication. That's important. They'll come back to it again and again, just like when I see a newsletter from the SBA, I pay attention because I know there's good and important information in there for me. That's incredibly important. But when I asked them about where do they think they would find information about a proposal lab, and this is equally important, the top answer to that was social media. They expect to learn about information on social media. And again, if you don't have a trusting relationship with people, you just can't be on social media and all of a sudden start putting information out there. It's not going to do any good. That VCs, and then of course, they said TEDCO was where they would expect to find information. So I'm looking at this, and I'm looking at, you know, us talking about the challenges of, you know, the longer term and the more systemic issues that we have, and some of the things that Damon just mentioned that we need to be looking at are much longer term. And I'm more immediate. What can I do today? What can I do right now to help companies? And the greatest thing I can do right now personally is this, you know, running this proposal lab and helping these companies, giving them the support that they need, and teaching them this skill of proposal writing that's going to last the life of their business. You know, we talked, and there's a lot of conversation in chat about how long does it take to write your first SBIR? And we say around 150 to 160 hours. I've heard longer than that. That's probably just time for a lot of drinking and swearing going on, because it's really challenging to write a proposal. But we can help companies learn these important skills. And I think that's what every entrepreneur support organization needs to look at. What can they do to reduce the risk, to lessen the burden, to teach companies how to respond? It's all very, very teachable. I hope that answered your question, Tori.
Great, thank you. Yes, and so we heard a lot in the previous panel that applications were, you know, very difficult. and a pain to fill out. But we also heard how important it was to have a mentor or a coach or somebody to help them kind of through the process. And so, Mr. Bowie, so you run a program that actually matches professionals from Boston Consulting Group with founders. And we, a lot of the, on the previous panel, the founders were talking about having people understanding from a cultural standpoint where they are and meeting them there. So can you talk a little bit about when you do those matches, how important it is to build a level of trust? How long does that take? What are some ideas for other ESOs who might be matching mentors and coaches to help people go through this process?
Yeah, great. Happy to do that, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. And so, to the point that you're going through, I think we're running the 7th cohort of the Majira project in the fall. Majira Swahili for summer. So in a nod to the growing season, we try to help companies to grow. And we do that through consulting, coaching, connections, capital. So to your point, we typically will give like 5 to 8 consultants for each team. They are typically not full of Black and Latinx and Indigenous consultants from BCG. So I think we're doing a really, stressing, trying to be as culturally competent and, share information with those teams. But in addition to that, what we try to do is make sure that before they engage in the program, these entrepreneurs, these teams, that we talk to them about how they best leverage the engagement. It's typically a 12 to 16 week engagement between September and February. But what we also do is we provide a business coach. Typically, that is someone who is understands the culture a little bit more and understands and has worked with founders of color. Not necessarily has to be a founder or an entrepreneur or VC of color, but oftentimes they are. And we also do some leadership coaching, and we're a cohort model. So I think the other piece is we try to connect, people with other founders who've gone through this before, because I think all of this really gets back to ecosystem, whether it's TEDCO or wherever. How do we do that? And I think a big piece of that is how do we do that more through our university systems. I said I came over. I'm actually right in the middle of a kickoff of an I-Core session, and I teach with the MIT New England Regional Innovation Node. But just thinking like, how do we structurally make sure that we're having more of that for our HBCUs and MSIs? And I think I saw in the participants, I think Dr. Grant Warner from Howard University is here, and Dr. Amisha Campbell from Jackson State University. So they're running sites, and I know they're doing great work, but how can we expand upon the efforts that they're doing and others? And how can we make connections between some of the PWIs as well with those institutions?
Right, thank you. So I have one quick follow-up question, and I'm not sure the answer, but from the I-Core, do you have to be, I saw this earlier in the chat, do you have to be associated with the university to go through the I-Core program?
Yeah, at least my understanding, typically you're looking at the companies that come in are tied to a university. They typically come through and are recommended by one of the sites or nodes. And so I think that is true. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe you don't have to be, but if not, 95% of the ones that I have seen have been. So even if it's not the rule, the written rule, it is it feels like what it is.
I think the way, and this is maybe Diane Hickey could answer this question, or somebody from NSF, but there are rules about the NSF's I-Core, right? So I-Core is a brand, but there are other I-Core programs. For example, my company, so I had a robotics startup, And we went through a 3-week I-Corps program. So it was like a mini I-Corps, it was a taste of I-Corps, even though I already knew what it was because I'd led companies through it before. TEDCO, because we have these rural companies, we pay for an I-Corps program over the summer that rural companies can participate in. And these are not companies that are connected to a university. So it's not NSF branded I-Corps, Kerry, which I know is what you're talking about, that intensive, lots of mentors, lots of education, lots and lots of interviews. These are usually scaled down versions. So at least we have that in Maryland. I know that, and I think Virginia does as well.
Yeah, so Tori, let me follow up on that and I think a few people have answered in the chat. So I was talking about specifically the national teams model, and so that is a 7-week program, and I was talking about the NSF model. So there are different brands. So NIH has a model. I think Air Force. There are a handful of different brands, but there are also regional brands as well. MIT has one called Spark. It's only 3 weeks. I think there may not be the same requirements for those because they're typically at the front of the pipeline trying to get more people into the system. And I know, I think there's in Virginia or DC, there's one that's looking more sort of traditional SBIR small businesses. So I'm sure they're not going to be tied to universities. So yeah, there are other versions where you don't have to be linked to a university.
Well, and so, yes, thank you, Kim and Kerry for expanding, and for the people in the chat, because what I clearly heard in the panel before was that I-Corps has been, is such a fantastic tool for helping companies actually get to the SBIR, to a place where, they can actually get the award. So it might be one of the things that we think about relative to, how can we improve everything. But now let me get Ms. Dorsey into the discussion. Ms. Dorsey, you review SBIR grant applications. So you're in the room. What are some of the things you look for that make an application really stand out? And as someone who serves on it, are there things in that room that you would want to change that could help make things more inclusive?
Yes, thanks for having me, and thanks for the great questions. I would say first off, high level, what we're looking for is really intellectual merit and looking at the broader impacts there. And so particularly, what stands out is the commercial potential, because what you'll see is that there's a lot of great technology, but not necessarily a market for it. And so even though, that would have an impact, I think to a certain extent that impact would be limited. And we want to see that it could have as much impact as possible. And so really, when you think about the commercial side, really looking at, has the, entrepreneur really understood the impacts of the space in terms of what's the market and what's the market size? And then also whether this is commercially scalable technology. And thinking about, the customer, because at the end of the day, you have to get sales, you have to get customers. And so do they understand how the customer, is going to respond to this product, or even thinking about the use case? And also whether it's something that is sort of, for instance, some companies are able to get a few customers, but they can't sort of get the traction to get the, requisite customers needed to make this a viable enterprise. And so really understanding what the traction might be there, and really the momentum that they can get, and understanding sort of the customer retention and just usability. So I would say high level, the commercial side is really something that we focus on. And then, the uniqueness and the competition, because we want to see that, this is transformative tech that's not iterative, but something that's really differentiated. It has a unique selling proposition. The value proposition is strong, such that you're not seeing anything sort of in the market that's like it, or if there is, they have a strong competitive edge there. And then thinking about, just generally in the competitive landscape, how they're really going to be able to take the edge and really make the product something that is, transformational. So I would say really driving the, competition and really having that angle and edge there is really important. Just because we want to see that it's something that's, very unique and something that will really drive the needle in whatever aspect they're looking to change. So I would say competition, uniqueness, and commercial potential are really high level areas that really stand out. And then I would say, aspects that could be sort of changed in the review room. Now it's done virtually, but I would say, really actually changing some of the criteria that we look at. And so, the criteria is pretty transparent. If you look on the NSF website, they have their merit review principles. But I think, looking at some criteria, adding, whether these are, underrepresented individuals, or will the impacts be for communities that are underrepresented, et cetera, could really be something that could be taken into consideration during the criteria review phase as well.
Great, thank you for that. That actually kind of dovetails, I think, a little bit into a question that I'll go back to Dr. Tull. One of your recommendations was to look more at social innovation. And I'm curious to know how you frame social innovation relative to some of the things that that Stephanie just talked about. Because when I've been in the room and as I've looked at how my experience was with NSF, it's always high tech. We're looking at technology and the competition, et cetera. But I think this social innovation piece is a really important one. So can you expand a little bit on how you're thinking about that?
So sure, I think almost everything that we do, we could look at return on investment, we can look at all of these different metrics, and we can always put an S in front of it and say what it is: social return on investment, social impact, social broader impact. So this is an opportunity, because one of the challenges with science and engineering in general, and I think, broadly speaking, is that it limits, as you described, to high-tech entrepreneurship, which I believe is a very important driver of our economy. It should not be neglected, and nothing should be done to subtract from that. However, there are many innovations that we must deal with some real issues in our country that other disciplines are addressing in a scientific way and in a research-oriented way that needs to be funded in a way that the SBIR does. I believe what SBIR represents is a review process and a vetting process that is actually top rank, top flight, in that regard. So I think there's an opportunity to do that. And that includes everything from social justice, that includes, environmental concerns, that includes the things that we're dealing with right now, top of mind for many of us who are living in the United States and around the world. So I see an opportunity to do that. And just a little bit of personal information about this issue is that, I have hands-on experience with the SBIR program. And in fact, for many years, and I've seen many of the concerns, and I'm disheartened a little bit from hearing today the same concerns I had 20 years ago. I'm hearing 1998, 1999 narrative in 2021. So there's a real need to change the way things are done. And a question in the chat related to this idea. Now, you mentioned social innovation. That's just simply another criteria, in my opinion, that would be added to the conversation, where does this have a social impact that is sustainable, but not necessarily one of those other types of impacts that we look at in terms of acquiring new scientific knowledge, and perhaps that could be the case. But in the chat, there was a question that I wanted to address, because it was an interesting bout of measuring participation. I think a lot of it has to do about when you ask the question. If you're applying for a grant or applying for something, and when you ask that demographic data question, it can be a little bit sensitive. Am I going to be judged accordingly? And especially when you look at the outputs, you're wondering whether or not it's actually being utilized, or if there's some factor in there. And in terms of ownership and everything of this nature, I believe at some point in some time, you're going to have to report that status, whether you're SDB or minority-owned business, women-owned business, that's somewhere along the line. And yes, it is self-reported, and that's the best data that we have. In terms of encouraging that, I would encourage, for example, sampling at different timeframes in different places. Meaning that after you've received the award, what is it that, so ask the question now so that you can get the information about your awardees. It's a little bit more difficult to get it in the participant or the applicant data. But you want to be able to ultimately, if you had all your everything aligned right, you'd want your applicant data distribution to look like your awardee distribution. And if you can get that, you're on your way to parity, in the sense that you're on your way to being equitable. But in terms of the reporting, it is always self-reporting, and it's also very much voluntary. And I don't think we should do anything otherwise. But with the following exception, federal agencies do have unique access to databases to obtain this information passively through appropriate agreements and privacy agreements, and to accumulate this information in aggregate. That's very well a possibility under special circumstances to do this for the purposes of advancing equity in these spaces, to obtain that information passively through federal databases.
Yeah, I think that is a really important component, because I do know that there are many people who are very uncomfortable answering those questions, especially pre-panel and review. So that excellent suggestion. So 50% of the participants on today's summit are the ecosystem ESO, and our panelists are from Boston, Maryland, California, and New Orleans. And so it's a very diverse group from a geographic standpoint. I'm going to throw this question out. My experience is that innovation, that the local community is so important to the success of companies. And part of that is, there's kind of a high touch need for mentors and coaches, even though I know we can do it through Zoom and other means. I'm curious to know, for all the panelists, what you think in your community has allowed you to be successful as an ESO, or someone working in this space. And yeah, maybe Stephanie, we'll start with you, and then.
Perfect. I would say New Orleans is a maturing ecosystem. It's really small when you think about entrepreneurship and sort of just innovation in the space. But I think by virtue of it being small, it's really strong. And so, there is federal attention and state attention going towards building out the ecosystem. And so, recently they built the Bioinnovation Center. We have more, funding going into entrepreneurial organizations and accelerators and incubators in the space. But it's still very much, relationship driven. And you sort of, once you get into the ecosystem, for instance, when I moved here to start the fund, you meet sort of the right person and they connect you to the sort of New Orleans entrepreneurial network. So I think really leaning into those relationships and understanding sort of the lay of the land can really help you in the beginning stages get connected to the right people. Just because, you can get connected to the organization sometimes, but if you don't know the right person, you'll sort of get lost in the bureaucracy of things. So really understanding the decision makers in certain organizations and just, key sort of movers and shakers in town can really help you just sort of get your grounding in the space. And then the sort of cycle really builds upon itself. So once you know the right people, then people understand what you're doing and people can come to you, et cetera. So I think really having a strong, networked community is super important. And that's what we have in New Orleans, but there's still so much room for growth.
Tori, go ahead.
Okay, good. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So Boston is not a big city, but pound for pound for sort of angel VC innovation entrepreneurship, I think we're probably punching above our weight. The problem is it hasn't been really targeted towards Black, Latinx, and indigenous founders, which sort of adds insult to injury in a sense that we know how to do it. Why is it missing our Black and brown founders? And so I think there has been a lot, not just in Boston, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Walter Wallace, the events of the past couple of years have, brought this sort of newfound wokeness to the country about some of the issues and plights of people of color, especially entrepreneurs of color. And there's still a lot of work to be done. As Stephanie's talking about, what she's doing. If you think of the numbers, and I'll give you a Boston number and a national number. Part of the reason we jumped into this work was a Federal Reserve Bank report from 2015 based on 2014 data that said the average net worth of a white family in Boston was $247,500 versus the average net worth of a black family being $8. That's sort of what pulled me out of state government. I was working for Governor Patrick and Governor Baker after that. And I was like, I can't be doing just environmental justice work. I need to do economic justice work and social justice work. And then I started to do this entrepreneur support work and realized that the people I want to help the most can't pay me to do it. So there's just all of these issues. So that's how Majira started. I had to go the nonprofit route. And then as I did that work, I realized that technical assistance consulting advisory is great, but these companies still need money. You know, the national number I'll give is, I think 2 to 4% of VC funding goes to women. Like 1% goes to African American women. So if you're, Stephanie, I'm doing the eyeball test. I'm assuming you're an African American woman. It's like 0.002% go to Africa. Like we've got to fix that. And we've got to have it where, and in a sense, I'll say VCs can do whatever they want to do. It's sort of their money. The government can't. It's not their money. It's our money. And so the government, we should be doing this. We should be even more beholden for the funding that we have to be spent in a way that reflects the citizenry. And we even have things like Justice 40 in the Biden-Harris administration that says, 40% of these funds going to Build Back Better and infrastructure plan should go to vulnerable communities. What does that look like? Does it really get to the people who need it the most? And what is the plan to make that happen?
Oh, I think that's the excellent points. Well made. What, Dr. Tull, were you?
Yeah, to piggyback on what Kerry was just saying, that exactly right. I mean, in 2020, 0.6% of venture capital went to Black founders, 0.6%. Again, another red flashing indicator light of what's happening in the ecosystem. And I'm here in California. I recently moved here 3 years ago from Washington, D.C. metro area, and I am in the belly of the beast of innovation and entrepreneurship. And when you look at California's contribution to this area of venture capital, 52% of venture capital occurs here in California. That's punching above your weight. Significantly when you represent almost 12% of the US population. So when you're looking at this data, you're saying, well, what can we do differently? And this is exactly what we're doing. I happen to be leading a group out of the University of California Office of the President called the Inclusive Innovation Equitable Entrepreneurship Initiative. It is a UC-wide, system-wide observation of the ecosystem as it's executed from idea to commercialization within the University of California. This effort impacts more than 300,000 students and hundreds of thousands of faculty, and how we're going to broaden participation, how we will broaden participation in innovation and entrepreneurship. And again, this is a UC-wide effort, and I wanted to thank Dr. Teresa Maldonado, Vice President of R&I, for her sponsorship, and President Michael Drake for his sponsorship for that effort. Because we are actually involved with 52% of venture capital. We expect changes that are made in California will reflect in the national numbers. And there's a lot of activity in this area, as you mentioned, ever since the murder of George Floyd and many others during the many years, but the consciousness arose. And so we have since been involved with this project for almost 2 years, and now we're in the midst of a 1 year mega sprint, if you will, to do a deep dive and a report that's coming out later this fall. But there's a lot of interest and effort to increase participation, not in just receiving venture capital, but in small business innovation grants and other areas of funding that flows to founders.
Thanks. Kim, you want to comment on the Maryland ecosystem? And then I have a couple of questions from the audience that I'd like to ask.
Yes. So the first thing, I'll just go over briefly what my program is about. So it's a 5-month program. You apply, there's a vetting process. You're selected, you pay a small fee to participate. One of the things we do that is significantly different than what anybody else does is provide mentors for these companies. So their proposals are being reviewed a total of 6 times by different experts. Some of them are experts in proposal writing. And we do teach them why you need to use an 11-point font if an 11-point font is what's called for. Because if you decide you're going to use a 10-point font and you decide you get to have more information on the page than anybody else, we remove fairness there. So we don't do that. Plus, it makes your reviewers crazy when you're reviewing, 6 proposals and they're all in this little teeny tiny font. So we teach them everything from that nitpicky kind of thing to how to convey their ideas clearly, which is something that we know is a problem. We've heard that today. People don't know how to write proposals. It's a very teachable skill. But we pull mentors from a program that TEDCO has called Network Advisors. And these are vetted, just really, I hate to say high value people because everybody is high value, but these are people that they're very valuable in this situation because of the expertise that they have. They have different industry backgrounds. They come from some of the federal labs, so they could have deep research expertise, or from universities. They're from Google and Amazon. They're serial founders. It's just that we have 100 of them right now, and I compare their skills and expertise to the industries and the topic areas that my companies are responding to. So I use the NSF solicitation every year as a teaching tool. And we break that down and provide a very detailed outline for entrepreneurs to follow, so that as they're doing that, they're learning how to pull a proposal apart and understand and respond to that proposal. So each company gets 6 reviews of their proposal. One when it's 60% ready to be submitted, and the second review is when they're 90% ready to be submitted. And we've got a cohort getting ready to do that right now. They're going to be reviewed at the beginning of June by their second set of experts. They have an opportunity to meet one-on-one with them, and if they would like to, they can potentially hire them. From time to time, TEDCO has enough funding that we can provide a loaned executive for companies. So companies have that option to apply for that funding. Not everybody gets it, of course, but this is a very intentional, very laborious matchmaking process that I spend a lot of time getting to know my companies, getting to know these mentors, making sure that they're matched appropriately, and then they have an opportunity to meet with them. So one of the things that I want to point out, though, we talk about trying to use the SBIR program for all things, and I think it's really important. I wouldn't say we necessarily talk about that, but I think that it's important to understand that each agency has a mission. So this is part of what I teach companies, is that you don't just apply to NSF because your colleague applied to NSF. You apply to NSF if you've got really super cutting edge research. If you don't, or if you're at a TRL 7, you don't belong to NSF. You need to look for another agency that maybe would have SBIR funding. So there are 11 agencies. We need to teach companies how to do research to make sure that the solution they're developing is appropriate for the agency that they're applying to. Like if the Army isn't interested in what you're doing, maybe NIH is. The Army's program says their program provides the Army access to technology that helps meet mission needs and provides seed funds to small businesses. So this is something, first thing it says is it meets mission needs for the Army, right? NSF has goals that what they're trying to do with their SBIR funding. So we have to first work within those parameters and then see how do we then find the right businesses, match them with the right agencies, provide them with the right support, surround them with the proper ecosystem.
Great.
My 2 cents.
Thank you. Okay, so a couple of questions that we have that are directed. Stephanie, how involved is the Greater New Orleans Foundation in convening ecosystem stakeholders and providing networking and social capital in your area?
Yeah, I'm familiar with what they're working on particularly. I would say, really the areas that I've seen are booming when it comes to that support is sort of the accelerator ecosystem. So I would say, for incubators as well, Propeller, you also have other incubators like that, like Idea Village, that are really strong in the ecosystem. And then sort of the government funded resources like the Bioinnovation Center also provides the network and access they need for those early stages. But I would say other than that, I don't know much about what the foundation work is doing there.
Okay, thank you. And Kerry, I think there were a couple of chat questions that you wanted to address.
Yeah, and I'll try to hit some of them quickly if I can. I saw one about EDA and some work going on in Boston and New Orleans. I'm somewhat familiar with it, but to Stephanie's, sort of following up with Stephanie, I think oftentimes, and this is coming from someone who worked in state government, federal employees, they're sort of overworked and underpaid oftentimes, and they can't be everywhere. So I think we got to have a better system to be connected. I think what they typically do will work with the usual suspects. And so a usual suspect in Boston might be a larger organization like a Mass Challenge, or or like the big names of Techstars or something like that. And oftentimes aren't the folk who are necessarily, they're doing great work, but very small percentages likely are going to Black and Latinx and Indigenous folk. So I think they're starting to do it, and we're seeing more attention, and hopefully we can get more there. I think I saw another question about, hey, this seems pretty NSF focused, but I think Tori just said, or Kim, like 11 agencies. So there are others who are doing this, and maybe this answers two of the questions. Part of the reason we do the NSF I-Corps program, the budget for like SBIRs is like, I think it was like 8.9 billion last year. And the whole piece of it is to go, can we help engineers and scientists to think about commercialization better? Not just tech and being in the lab. How do we make it so this is something real that somebody cares about and will be a paying customer for? We can do that in a lot of these other places, but Department of Defense is going to be very different in a sense on some of those things. So I do believe NSF, because it's very industry agnostic, and we're but DoD, I think, like minorities altogether, I think I heard a horrible number from a few years back, like 0.8% goes to minority. I mean, we're talking probably trillions of dollars, or definitely billions of dollars. Even, and our real number would be like 30 or 40%. If we could just get to 3%, like that, can you imagine the game changer that would be for folk? And then the last one I'll answer is about entrepreneur support organizations. I think one is what we're doing now, but even more and more frequently. How do we get people connected to Kim's program? How do we make connections within intra and inter across all these different places, and not just on the coast, in the Midwest? I'm originally in the South, and I'm originally from Alabama. I'm a part of an organization called the Black Innovation Alliance, and part of what we're trying to do is exactly that, connect ecosystem support, organizations all across the country. We actually just had a Black Innovation Summit in DC a couple of weeks ago, talking about some legislation and how do we do some of this work. And the group, because I'm doing NSF I-Corps, I couldn't make it, but a large contingent is in Fort Lauderdale now at a summit, talking about some of these same types of things. How do we do a better job of making sure we are connected? Because, I'll go back to Boston. I think Tip O'Neill said, all politics is local. And so we really need to be on the ground in New Orleans and Detroit and Chicago and DC and Philly and Minneapolis, LA, the Bay, all Houston, Dallas, Austin, like all those different places, and others that I did not name. Some of the smaller, the Birminghams and St. Louis's.
St. Louis, yes, let's mention St. Louis. We're not going to leave them out of this conversation. So, so by the way, I grew up in Birmingham. I've been in St. Louis for 30 years, but I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure. One of the things that we face in St. Louis is that, there is certainly a significant socioeconomic and racial divide here. We have a great university in Washington University. I teach bioentrepreneurship there. But when you start to look at the businesses and supporting the communities that are low income, they don't necessarily have what I think many of the agencies would consider STEM technologies. And I'm curious to know from the whole panel, there are business opportunities there, and bridging the gap to SBIR type funding seems to be just a huge gulf because of the criteria. Is there even a possibility of changing some of that SBIR funding because it's needed for some of these businesses that maybe, you know, don't match the STEM or high tech type opportunities?
I think I want to just talk about that for a second. So I like the concept, right? So TEDCO is an organization founded, you know, the state set this up because we have twice as many federal labs in Maryland than any other state. And we want to pull value out of those labs. So we have morphed into this funding arm. So we've got a lot of money. We are kind of the VC for funding technology companies in the state. We've got a variety of different funds. And one of those that we have a fairly new in the last year chief investment officer. And one of the things he did was set up this social impact fund. So we're being very intentional about who we're helping and at what stage we're helping them. So this is a very new companies. I can put a link in the chat if people are interested in learning more about how we have that fund structured and things like that. But I think the point is that this funding is for innovation and research, right? That's what it's for. And so my organization, TEDCO, the Maryland Technology Development Corporation, we're looking at, you know, how do we take care of more? We want to take care of more companies. And as different industries become more technologically advanced, there's more opportunity for us to do that, to pull these companies in. But there are companies that we're probably just not ever going to fund because they don't fit into our mission and our charter that you know we have with the state. And I think the same is true with these programs. So I don't know if the conversation is, do we change SBIR and move away from technological innovation, or do we need another program that meets some of the things Damon was talking about? He's talking, and I'm thinking, we need that. Don't know if we can do it within SBIR, but do we need another program? Do we need additional funding? And I'm just going to say one more thing because I think this is important. We need more money to run these programs. This program that I'm running right now, it's really not sustainable the way that we're doing it right now. Yeah, so I think a lot of times throwing money at the problem isn't the right solution. But in this case, when education is, I think, the number one thing we need to offer to companies, education and along with that mentorship, that's expensive. That's an expensive proposition.
Yeah, and I think
I
Kerry,
agree with Kim on that. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Kerry's comment earlier about, you know, who's going to pay for my services. It's so hard to get these organizations off the ground. I think ESOs need more funding, whether it's from local philanthropic, whether it's from the government. We've got to figure that out. But I'm going to let Dr. Tull, Damon, you, and then Kerry, and then Stephanie have kind of some final remarks before we kind of wind up.
Well, I'm so glad we had the opportunity to have this conversation today because the stakes are high. And we're in a situation where we're intense international competition. There was a recent economic report that was a little bit staggering. If we would have addressed racial bias in the access to entrepreneurial capital and education and wages just 20 years ago, we would have added $16 trillion to our national GDP. That is the size of China in GDP in 2020. And so this is an opportunity to grow our own, to work with who's here. That is an opportunity that we should not miss. And I believe we have the right leaders in place and the opportunity to make this change. And I believe it's going to lead to a better quality of life for the entire nation and a greater competition, more in a sustained primacy of the United States in innovation, which is personally one of my goals. I hope that there's some changes. I agree with Kim and what was said earlier about the SBIR program does have its own scope and frame. I believe, however, the I can be broadened. The innovation component, the innovative aspect of the SBIR program can be broadened to include social innovations, which must be sustainable, which leads to some level of engagement. So I believe that that's an opportunity for the SBIR program, the SBA and the IOI, and again, introducing these structures that will help to administer well-researched interventions to help broaden participation and be more inclusive in the SBIR program, work with minority serving institutions in a more collaborative way to engage faculty and at small and medium colleges as well as MSIs. I think all those things are possible given the current climate. I believe in one final point is that we are growing the pie. Let's grow the pie and divide it well. And I think we'll be in good shape.
Thank you. We have about 3 minutes, Kerry and Stephanie. Oh, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
To add to what Kim and Dr. Tull were saying, what I would say is maybe not the SBIR, possibly, but it should be somewhere. So I'll just talk I-Corps. What we're doing is we're giving like $50,000 a team to people who sort of have business plans to see if they can build businesses. We can go out into neighborhoods all across the country where there are already businesses that don't sort of have business plans. They're like mom and pops who've been around. Why don't we give them $50,000 to go and do customer discovery and to revamp what they're doing and to reach other customers? I think that's a perfect opportunity to do that. And everything doesn't have to be hockey stick exponential growth. We got to have some linear, geometric, like that's what's missing. That's why the Black and Latinx and Indigenous folk don't have an aunt who can write them a $25,000 check. If they had that, we need to focus on Main Street, not just Wall Street. And, you know, I've got 2 MIT degrees, but it's not all about tech.
Great. Thank you. And Stephanie, you have the last word.
Yes, I know I have a minute, but just to piggyback on what everyone said, which I completely agree with, it's ultimately about connectivity to communities, but access to capital. I mean, that's why there's a valley of death from just ideas to, you know, executing and creating a company and then going to that next stage. But without capital to really build the business, show traction, show a business model, and really show the ability to get to that next level, they'll never be able to get there.
Thank you. The panelists, you guys were fantastic. I think there was a lot covered in this session and a lot of ideas. I encourage everyone to kind of, if there are any other comments, to go directly to the panelists, and I will turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you, everyone, for, again, for all of the work that you do every day to build this inclusive innovation ecosystem and for sharing all that information. It's my pleasure now to get to introduce my co-conspirator, Nancy Kamei, who co-chairs the Innovation Ecosystem Engagement Team that put on this summit. Thank you, Nancy.
Thanks, Jennifer. Well, we hope that today's Idea Summit was both informative and thought-provoking. It seems fitting that today, on this 68th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, that we are here identifying ways to improve access for all innovators to fully participate in the United States innovation ecosystem. Making sure that the $150 billion annual taxpayer investment in research and development leads to meaningful and equitable impact through products, services, and companies is a whole of government priority, coordinated through the Interagency Lab to Market Subcommittee. Lab to Market aims to strengthen the nation's ability to transition federally funded research from the laboratory to the marketplace. You saw the results of a Lab to Market interagency collaboration here today to make sure the voices of innovators, from different backgrounds are heard by federal agencies running different programs and initiatives. Public servants across many different agencies are working to improve the lab-to-market ecosystem on different dimensions, reducing administrative burdens, developing new tools to support technology transfer, and identifying ways to enhance support for innovators as technologies move from basic research to development and eventual deployment. We want to hear your input about barriers facing innovators and also your recommendations about ways that the government can meet the needs of innovators to improve access to the innovation ecosystem for all. I can't tell, is my slide up?
Your slide is up.
We had hoped today that we were going to be able to announce a mechanism, a formal mechanism that you would be able to give your input. But unfortunately, it's not quite all the way through the approval process, but we expect that very, very soon. And what will happen is in the upcoming days, we will send out an email to you, which gives you the instructions about how you can submit your input. This input will be used by the Lab to Market Committee, as well as members of the National Science and Technology Council, to think about ways that we can improve existing government programs or maybe start up some new programs or initiatives. At this point, I just want to thank each and every one of you for your participation today in the Idea Summit. You will be hearing from us very soon, and we are really looking forward to your input. So at this point, I'm just going to turn it back to Jennifer.
And the only thing I really have to say is to express my gratitude for all, again, Nancy as a co-chair and all of the amazing team members and innovators that are public servants who made this happen and who are listening. So thank you to also the established team for producing this event and also for hosting and partnering with Dr. Grant Warner on doing the customer discovery work itself. This is really just the start. So please do be on the lookout for more discussion, but more importantly for action. We know that we've been talking about things for many, many years, and really it's time to change things, and we are trying. So thank you for your patience, for your collaboration, and we really look forward to working with you.